Good morning, everybody. So I'm very glad that you're here on the second day in the morning after a wonderful evening yesterday. I will be speaking today from my perspective as a French scholar and as a citizen of France, actually, and a member of French scholarly academic communities since about the 1990s. I do work in the United States. I am a US citizen as well, but today I want to speak from the perspective of the work that I've done in France. So I just wanted to say that from the start. I'd also like to say from the start that the conference so far has just been phenomenal. So everything that I've been able to learn and hear, both in sessions and maybe even more importantly, in the conversations that we all have in the hallway and over a glass of wine or coffee or whatever it is, I'm just so glad to be a member of EATAW, so I wanted to start with that as well. It is a plenary workshop. EATAW has offered some plenary workshops in the past, although not every year or not every conference. So it's a little bit of an unusual format, and we will make do the best we can with this particular structure, which I know John needed to use this room to do the session. So for the topic, I will try to build from Paul Matsuda's keynote talk yesterday. My focus will be on the value of and our access to existing work written in and about first language writing in European higher education. And I hope that the discussion that we'll have, both the initial framing that I will do and then the discussion that you'll do a couple of different times in small groups or with each other, will result in collective paths forward that will be useful to EATAW as an organization and to the membership of EATAW, which is really all of us. So that's my general plan. I think this is, as a workshop, an opportunity to act as a community and to move forward as a community and to talk about the issues that have been raised in the conference so far and also other issues that I might not bring up but that you might want to talk with each other about. So I hope it'll frame all of that for you. I will speak for about 20 minutes at first just to sort of set the stage, and then we'll have one group activity, and then there'll be some full discussion after that, and then a second group activity, and then a little bit of full discussion after that, so just to give you a sense of the day. The main sort of stance or argument that I'd like to make, it's maybe not so much an argument as just a suggestion that I'd like to make, is that ultimately we know that L1 higher education writing, teaching, and research is quite healthy across languages in Europe, and that the real issue, I think, is maybe visibility and valuing rather than absence. As much as we might hear that we need to develop more research and teaching, and I think we do, in France I hear that actually all the time, we should also, or maybe even first, seek to support and highlight and expose and distribute what is already happening. And that's what I hope to have us shape and share today, sort of strategies for valuing and strategies for making more visible why we might value for ourselves certain kinds of research and how we might make that more visible for other people. There's another purpose for wanting to have the discussion today about valuing and about making visible. I would go so far as to propose, and this is something I've been thinking about a lot just in the last couple of days, in conversation actually with a lot of you, I would go so far as to propose that in the European context today, attention to L1 is de facto attention to multilinguality. And multilinguality, or at least bilinguality, is the future. So I just want to sort of make that connection at the start and then see how that develops through our conversations today. Otto Kruse yesterday in his comment, in one of his questions during the keynote, noted that multilinguality really is already the reality and in fact has been for centuries the reality. Resisting loss is a daily activity for anyone who works, at least in France, this is true, for anyone who works in France. But so is gaining value, right? So sort of loss and gaining value are two parts to the same picture. English certainly serves useful purposes, and it's an important part of what's happening. But multilinguality or bilinguality, which starts with L1 work, is equally a resource and an important value. So my question really is, how do we maintain both? How do we make sure that both are part of the ongoing future work and conversation in teaching and in research? And I hope the workshop will be an opportunity to collectively sort of work on that question. I also hope there'll be lots of debate and discussion, so you might not agree with a lot of what I have to say, and that would be great. There's no, I think that having that kind of debate and discussion is part of what will help this component of European work remain a strong partner in terms of the other interests in EATAW, at least as I've seen them develop over the years that I've been part of the discussion. Okay, so the two key questions that I have for us. The first is, what do we value, personally or politically, or maybe both, in first language teaching and research? And then how might that intersect actually with L2 and with multilingual questions? And the second one is, how might we work to make what Paul yesterday called a multiplicity model? And he suggested that that model might be idealistic. I'm not so sure that it is. I think it actually might be very much the current reality. How might we make that even stronger? How might we make it ever more robust in the face of the pressures that we all feel coming from sort of the internationalization and English work that we encounter? So those are just the two sort of guiding questions for us. Let me begin by framing a little bit of my stance, of where I'm coming from personally. I think it's very important to consider and support and foster the valuable work on writing research and instruction in first languages in European higher education. And I use the word first language knowing full well that it is not the best word, nor is native, nor is local, nor is any word you might want to put primary or mother, or I'm not sure we've yet found really the best or a good term for how, so I'll use L1 and I'll use first, knowing that that's a contested term, but not having found a better one yet. So I think that we need to do that work not at the expense of L2 or English work. And of course, English work is L1 work for many of us in this room, right? So, that's the other kind of complication to the question, nor as a way to avoid reality, but just as a way to resist loss, to resist the eventual loss that we can face. A little bit of context in terms of where I see things right now, in terms of teaching and research in Europe, and the question of English, and some of this is going to recap some of what Paul suggested yesterday, but it'll also build a little bit some other possible topics and themes. The European context, you all know, is very much in flux, but I think it's in flux differently in terms of research and in terms of teaching. So let me just lay those two out quickly. In terms of research and scholarly production, and these are insights that I'd like to offer that come partly from a report that was prepared by Otto Kruse and Claudia Doroholski, almost. Not quite right. Based on aspects of an extended study that was done actually by a large group of European researchers in a cost project called Learning to Write Effectively, and many of the people who were in that project are here today. It's a project that involved dozens of European countries and was led by Otto Kruse and Montserrat Castelló. And that project, some of the materials that are starting to come out of that project have indicated some very specific things about both research and teaching across the European context. So in terms of the research part, English is rapidly dominating in terms of advancement and publication and science in the academic world. And of course, people like Christine Tardy or Teresa Lillis and Mary Jane Curry have also worked a lot on this topic. As a language of academic exchange in the hard sciences, it is already completely entrenched, I think. But it's very important to remember that that's in terms of the hard sciences, so that we don't just start to automatically say, something I read recently in an article I was reviewing was, English has become the language of intellectual exchange around the world. I'm not so sure. So, maybe in the hard sciences, but maybe not everywhere. And then as a language of in the social sciences and the humanities, the idea that English language publications are more valuable is actually becoming an accepted part of at least some of what's happening. I'll give you an example from France where, and it's particularly startling to me that it is in France actually, given their huge valuing of L1 work. The example is that in the last 5 or 6 years, it has actually become part of the evaluation system for faculty that if you write something published in English, it will double your value. You'll get 2 points of value for an English publication as opposed to 1 point of value for a French publication. And I know that France is not the only country where that's happening, but right, that's pretty interesting. I will just make a side note that I find interesting too, which is if you're publishing in Anglophone contexts, actively publishing in other languages is a plus, right? So it's sort of seen as a very highly valued thing. So I find that interesting that there's that kind of imbalance between the way those publications are being received. In terms of teaching, I think there's just a huge diversity of language roles in the European context. And again, this is drawing from the country studies that were done as part of the COST project, but I think that we've seen this in a lot of other cases as well. And the COST project itself, those studies are sort of always evolving and partial, and moving forward, they'll draw a lot more detail. The research group found a range of configurations, really, anywhere from countries with one official language, and in fact, in practice, one language, right? So sort of a very, in higher education, for example, in Poland or in Portugal, to countries with several official languages of instruction, and the option, or the option to write a final thesis in several different languages. So that's quite a range, right? And then also countries that explicitly support bilingualism or plurilingualism, right? So it's very clear to me that we can't talk about Europe and talk about teaching and research, right? That we have to be talking about individual contexts, individual institutions, and sort of how things are playing out in each of them in this huge diversity of the kinds of teaching that's going on. And then more broadly, in terms of teaching and research, in the European context in which multilinguality is the norm at this point, I think we already have some of the things that Paul mentioned yesterday. So we already have writing instruction in English alongside local and other international languages. We already have the infrastructure to support that, the desire to support that in some contexts. We have a great deal of recognition of the value of plurilingualism, a good deal of emphasis on translation, and also writing across the curriculum, or maybe more frequently writing in the disciplines because it fits better for the work that's happening. I think those things are things that are very much in evidence. And the last little note I'll make about this section before moving on to the next one is that it seems missing at times in our discussions overall about how languages work and about how they coexist in the context that many of us work in. One of the things I'm not sure we always clarify is the different roles that writing might have. So sort of on the one hand, the communicative role, and on the other hand, the epistemological or the knowledge construction role. And it's not innocent, right, to construct knowledge in one given language or another. It seems to me that our questions about L1 and L2 and English are not always taking that into account. We're not always thinking about the types of work we might be talking about when we talk about needing to work in languages we all share or needing to work in particular kinds of language contexts. Okay, so with that quick backdrop, let me just highlight very briefly a few examples of European L1 work in higher education writing. A few examples that I hope will bring out specific traditions of research and of teaching, of academic and scientific writing or writing instruction in context of those sort of home or primary institutional languages across Europe. These are just examples meant to be discussion starters, examples for the group discussion that you'll do in a little bit. And they're almost all, and this is the most important part about them, published in languages other than English. So it's not that the work in these examples I'm going to give you is new. It's that I want to show sort of the range and diversity of some of the work that is happening, and that's happening in and about languages in various countries other than in English. And I will start with the French work because it's the work that I know the best. And I do work there with lots of non-alarmist colleagues. So let me just share a few key strands in the area of university literacies, of this field that's actually been growing and developing just in the last maybe 6 or 7 years or so. The work's been happening much longer than that, but this field named university literacies, just the tag for it is a pretty recent tag. And it's a strand that works particularly and specifically by bringing together two different, very long-standing fields. One is linguistics and the other is didactics. So it brings those two together in order to look specifically at the kinds of writing happening at the university level, writing and reading actually happening at the university level, from the first-year student in the undergraduate all the way through the PhD student. So sort of a whole domain of work. And the key strands that have come out of that work, the first is the intertextuality or polyphony or citation strand, which looks very closely at how students work with sources, right? So extensive analyses of how students in writing in French higher education, how they are working with source material, with really interesting theoretical frames for that. The second one is the sort of particular types of higher education texts strand. And that's a strand that has really looked very carefully at all the different kinds of writing, the types of writing that are being done in French higher education, and how each type functions in terms of students' construction of knowledge. So how does that type facilitate or not the construction of knowledge that students are carrying out? And then the third is the affect and identity strand, and that's really focused on aspects of the self as writer and the connection between what we know about learning from didactics and what we know from educational psychology about how the self is constructed. And the second quick set of examples that I'll give you comes from work that has been posted to an online database called the Research Exchange, and I will come back to that later today when we do some group discussion about paths we might take forward for supporting ourselves. But I just want to give you these 4 examples because, again, they're from various contexts and they show sort of some of the work that, that is being done in the language of a particular country and published in that language. So the first is Denis Foucambert, who works on establishing the relationship between the writing process of a student and the written product by studying the physical production of the text on the one hand, using software to do that, and then the features of the produced text afterwards using some more traditional discourse analysis modes, right? So sort of bringing together those two to look at how the process and the product are interrelated. Helmut Gruber, who is here in the room and will actually do a little bit of talking a little bit later, has posted work on the development of a writing course for students at Vienna University. And he describes modules of online work complementing classroom work in order to develop students writing in different disciplines. So again, in the language of the context and working with students in different disciplines on that kind of work. And then the third example comes from Luc Van Wees, who's in the Netherlands, and who describes research using free software that he shows you how to download in this particular example, which enables the study of several different things, of keystroke logging, of mouse clicks, of speech capture, and of the online environments in which a student is producing a text, and which of those are being activated when as the student actually produces the text. And he's working on that in Dutch, in the language that the students are working in higher education. So there's just some quick examples of the kinds of things that people are doing. And the last thing that I want to say about this is my personal insights, and they're really just personal insights, so you might have very different perspective on this, about why this kind of work could end up not being valued and why it could end up not being visible, right? I'm not saying that it is not valued or not visible, just that it could be, that I could imagine why it could be. So in terms of why it could end up being not valued, the pressures that we've already talked about are the ones that come to mind. I mean, it's fairly easy to imagine that in terms of the institutional pressure for any of those examples, if you're being given 2 credits for publishing it in English and 1 for publishing it in the local language, chances are you might not be publishing it in the local language for that particular right. So it might be institutional pressure, but that doesn't mean that we don't value it. We, the community of people who are interested in these topics, right? So sort of teasing out who's valuing what might be really important. And the other reason I can imagine why this work could end up undervalued is because it is sometimes very local. Paul mentioned that yesterday as well. So, for example, the text types that are being used in France in French higher education, or the work that students are doing with sources, might be very local. It might be very specific to that context, and it might not be that easy to have that work sort of transfer into a larger conversation. So those are possible ways that it could be undervalued, and then possible ways that it might not be always visible, which is maybe even more important than the undervaluing part. The most obvious one is language, language barriers. In France in particular, there is less evident bi- or multilingualism, at least among the colleagues I work with. So you can imagine that the issue of things appearing in different languages just in terms of the language could be a barrier. But I think there are more important sort of larger issues that might be at play. One is that the theoretical frames, the schools of thought that are creating particular kinds of work are not always obvious to people who have not worked in those frames. The practices and the methods that are being used may be very different. The institutional context may be very different. Almost every cross-cultural project I have ever worked in the 20-some years that I've been working in different contexts, has produced that kind of challenge as the first challenge. It's not actually the language challenge that's the most important. Lisa mentioned yesterday that translation software might be a useful tool for us, and I think that's true. I think it probably is. But it only solves the language, or begins to solve the language question. It doesn't help with entering into the worldview of the work that someone's doing in another context. And I think that particular question is one that we might collectively want to take up. How can we start to think about making that possible with whatever kinds of resources we want to create? So that's the other thing that I can imagine we might want to grapple with or think about in order to make work more visible across these different contexts, right? Turning it into English is just a small part of the beginning of the kind of work that somebody would want to do if they wanted other people to access the work, or encouraging people to work in those languages. Okay, that's what I wanted to say in terms of framing comments and sort of general thoughts. Let me focus now on the kinds of things that I'm going to have you do in a little bit in small group discussion. I want to get to the interaction part. I did review all of the abstracts for the conference before thinking about the workshop that I would do today, because I was very interested in sort of what the main themes were just across the abstracts. So I did an actual count of types of abstracts after reading them all, and identified that sort of the largest by two strand is the teaching or researching writing in English as a second or as an additional language. So that's sort of the largest ×2 strand. And then teaching or researching writing in languages of particular countries or contexts, including English in Anglophone contexts, right? So any proposal that was about that. And then the third strand is teaching or researching the L1, L2 connections, which of course is another very strong way to study L1, right? If you're studying the connections between L1 and L2, you're studying L1. So I think those were, and then there's also a small number of presentations on multi or plurilingual issues in particular, or other relevant themes. Because of that combination, because of what you've all brought to this conference, I think you are uniquely positioned to collectively work on strategies for locating and accessing writing research that's produced in L1 languages in European contexts. And I think you're positioned to do it in a way that can inform any of the work any of us does in any of those strands that I just mentioned. I think we're more flexible and more adaptable and more open as a group of sort of thinkers and researchers. We were actually talking about that before the conference, just in terms of, before the talk this morning, I was talking with Nancy about how we're more flexible just in terms of being willing to do workshopping in a room like this. So, so I hope that we're also more flexible as thinkers sort of broadly. I mean, we're often more multilingual and we're more necessarily immersed in the questions of language and cross-cultural work. We tend not to be insular, right? So that's something to really use. So with that in mind, for the first activity, I want to focus on the first of the two questions I presented at the beginning. What do we value personally or politically in first language teaching and research? I've asked, as a way to start this conversation off, some EATAW presenters and colleagues to say a few things about the issues at hand in order to frame our first small group discussion. So these are all colleagues who have volunteered to stand up this morning and say something for less than 2 minutes about some aspect of research and teaching writing in the first language context. And I've asked them to start by answering Paul's final question from the keynote yesterday, which is, when have you written in a language other than English, or when will you? And then to build from that, to talk about why, what its value might be, what motivates you to do it, what its value might be to L2 scholars and teachers, or a story about your interaction between L1 work and international scholarship, and a challenge they faced or a value they gained. So they'll take some little aspect of that up. And then I will be asking you in small groups to work through very similar questions for yourselves, right, in groups of about 4 people. Possible paths that we might think about, some of them have already been brought up. And you can see them yourself as much as I can read them to you. So networks and focus on teaching L1 writing alongside L2, impact of the internet, which Paul brought up yesterday, which I think is a huge point. I know he didn't have time to develop it because he was developing a lot of other topics, but it's one that's really worth coming back to, how that might be changing some of these issues. Questions of translation software, questions of dictionaries, cross-cultural dictionaries. There's somebody presenting at the conference who's doing a German-English dictionary of science work, for example. Great example of sort of some of the kinds of things. More national organizations. This is actually something that EATAW has suggested. Creation of bi- and multilingual teaching materials, et cetera, right? So these are just sort of designed to think a little. And then in terms of what we might lose and what we might gain, also very quick sort of my personal take on those questions. These also just came up, right? English filters possibilities. English changes what we're understanding or thinking about, so that's not a small thing to forget. Any language does that, not specifically English, but if we're working in English. We don't read what we can't access, right? So that came up with the first group already. The identity loss that's possible if you're working no longer in the language you started in, but only in a different language. That question of whether you write first in English or first in German is a really interesting question, right, in terms of how that shapes things. Translation also being able to be a loss as well as a gain. And then in terms of gains, again, things I think we're all very familiar with, the value of the multilingual norm, the value of multilinguality, value of rhetorical flexibility, attention to student resistance, which is something that we bring to the table across the European context that I'm not sure always comes up in other contexts, and our desire for partnerships, which the last group mentioned, right? Our real desire to work cross-culturally and cross-collaboratively. I think that's an incredible strength that we don't always realize we can take full advantage of. Okay, so I'll stop this part just by saying that it is up to us to highlight and engage with the multilingual future that I think we're looking at in both teaching and research. And what I want to spend the last segment of the workshop doing is thinking about one possible way that we might engage. And when I say we here, I mean EATAW. It's a suggestion that we might make to the EATAW organization about a way to move forward. It's only one suggestion. It's one idea. You might have much better ideas. You might have other ideas. So this is just a chance to sort of work through one idea and what it might look like. And then we can talk about, you can talk in your groups actually if this idea is not an idea that works for you. You can talk in your group about other ideas that you might find better ways to move forward on the issues that we're talking about. So this is coming back to my initial question, how might we work to make our multiplicity model even stronger and ever more robust? And it responds, I think, in part to some of the needs and ideas that you just raised. The idea is to develop some kind of a living EATAW database that might push us further to be more aware of the work that a lot of us are doing that hasn't yet been translated into English or made available in English. As I said, it's just an idea. It may not be a good idea. That might be the end result of this discussion, is everyone saying, no, that's really not the way to go. We should really go this way instead, but let's give it a try and think about it. I thought we might sketch out the conditions that such a database would need to offer to make available research accessible or more accessible, to make it more visible, to make the work that everyone in EATAW is doing more visible. So in fact, it could include all research. I'm going to give you 2 quick examples on the internet of 2 sort of groups that are doing this already. One of them is called the Research Exchange. I mentioned it earlier, and actually Joan Mullen, who's one of the 2 people who organized the Research Exchange, is right here. And while I'm showing it to you, she's going to distribute a little handout in case you end up being interested in wanting to post your work to the Research Exchange, as did the people who I showed earlier. So she's just sending a sign up around for that. And the other one is a European-based database called Writing Pro, which has been developed by the European Association for Research in Language and Instruction. the SIG writing group in that. So I will show you each of them, really just show them to you so that you see these two examples, and then I'll turn you loose to think about what it might look like if we wanted to do something like this. So here is the research exchange. And what I wanted to show you is the kind of information that it asks for. So it's basically a living database where people post work in progress. You can post finished work as well, but it's often for work in progress, right, that you're sort of, you may not have published yet. It might actually be the best possible place to start to see what other people are doing that's similar work to yours. And what I wanted to show you, if you look over on the right-hand corner here where it says view, those are the sections of information that people post about their project. So general information, principal investigators, the team, the details of the study, and then any reflections or outcomes, right? So any project that gets posted includes all of that work. So that's one example. And here's the other example. This is the Writing Pro example. So I will show you the categories that they collect. It's more focused on writing process in particular. That's actually why it's called Writing Pro, right? So I don't know if you can see that or not, so I'll just tell you quickly what the categories are. There's a data repository. There's an area for data collection. There is a section on data analysis, a section on the literature of the report, and then a section to upload any presentations that have come from doing conference presentations. So it's a place to put conference presentation material that other people might be able to easily access and see. So again, both of these are not sort of formal publication, right? So there's lots of room for putting things up that are in process, and that might enable more free flow of information across different contexts than waiting for things to actually come out in publication. Obviously, neither of these tackles the language issue in any direct way, and that's one of the things that in your groups you might want to think about. What would it mean for EATAW if we were going to think about some way to make it easier for people to know about other people's research, no matter what the language is in any context. So let me just close that and go back to, sorry. Okay. So those are the two. If you want the URLs, they're right there. I can also send them to you if you just send me an email, but I wanted to let you know what those are. What I'd like you to do in the second group activity is to imagine what it would look like to create some kind of a tool like this. And again, you may decide as a group that you'd like to propose a very different kind of tool, or something that just doesn't, right, any kind of idea that you might have would be wonderful. I have a set of questions that have to do specifically with what you would think about if you were imagining this kind of tool. You can work with those, or you can work aside those. But here are the questions in any case for that. If we were going to imagine such a database, what would it look like? Would it support quality? Would it support networking? Would it improve access? What needs might it fill, especially from the needs that we were just talking about? Or other needs that may have come up. What intellectual steps would need to be taken? And by that I mean, at least in part, the kinds of things we were just talking about in terms of how do we work through questions of not just language, but all the other things that come along, the frames that come with the theoretical background, right? All of those kinds of things. What kinds of questions might have to go to the EATAW list as a whole to get sort of ideas and suggestions about how to do this or about what the needs are? And then the other ideas is for other ideas other than a database, other ways that we might try to get at that question, how might we work to make our multiplicity model even stronger and ever more robust as a group? How might we think about that? How might we move that forward? Okay, does that make sense? So I'm going to give you about 10 minutes to do this as well. You should feel free to work with the same group or a different group or any combination you'd like. But I would ask this time that you get one person in the group to be a scribe, because I'd like to actually collect your ideas, and I will collate all of those ideas and send them back out to everybody. So if you would have somebody just sketch down what your group comes up with, so that we can both talk about it at the end and also have a written copy of it that would be great, okay? You can handwrite it, or you can do it on your computer and send it to me, or whatever you'd like. Okay, I'll give you 10 minutes. Go ahead. So I will end by just saying that I do think EATAW is the place to be doing that. And I think you all are the right. EATAW membership, which is everyone, is the group that should be taking on these challenges and thinking about what it means for each of our work and for all of us together. And that was more than one sentence, so sorry. Thank you.